Hi, my name's Hellie Badaruddin, and I did my research project on the commonalities between the Muslim and Christian feminist interpretations of their sacred texts, which mainly focused on the methods they're using, what they're trying to do, and how they're achieving it. So, what I started out with is how both the Qur'an and the Bible have ideas of equality. However, that theme has gotten lost throughout countless interpretations. Women have minimal, if any, representation in power structures, fewer opportunities to participate in the faith, and experience sexism through the traditions and practices of both Islam and Christianity. To combat this, Muslim and Christian feminists focus on the fact that women are excluded from both the narratives and the interpretations of the sacred texts. Both the Muslim and Christian interpretations emphasize including women in the narrative, focusing on principles over direct rhetoric, and neutralizing language. So you may have noticed that most sacred texts, specifically the Bible and the Qur'an, are completely devoid of female voices, and that's no accident. So a lot of feminist interpretations are aiming towards adding a more feminine perspective and seeking out a more neutral language. Because a lack of representation through the exclusion of female narratives, language, and interpretation has diminished the perceived importance of women in the church. Their voicelessness during critical periods of development in the Quranic interpretations has not gone unnoticed, but it has been mistakenly equated with voicelessness in the text itself. And as many traditions are based on the Qur'an and the Bible, excluding women from the narrative leads to exclusion in the church. In the Bible, language and theoretical framework self-affirms the ruling male as normal and standard. Male-focused language does not give an objective account of reality, but interprets, constructs, and legitimizes reality in the interest of relations of exclusion and domination, by making men appear as natural or common sense. It delegitimizes women by leaving them out. For example, both Islam and Christianity assert that human beings were made in the image of God or Allah. But an androcentric interpretation of sacred texts implies that men were made in the image of God and Allah, and women continue to be excluded from that representation and that image of God. This distances women from their creator and implies that the female voice and other aspects of womanhood are unnatural. One of the main focuses of those feminist interpretations is adjusting the language and syntax. It's not just what they say, it's how they say it. Gendered language excludes women, as it often discusses both men and women, but only refers to men. The original languages of both the Qur'an, which was revealed in Arabic, and the Bible, which was predominantly written in Hebrew, are heavily gendered languages, which makes it difficult to include women even when that is the intention. There is a lack of neuter, which has led to most people thinking that most of the Quranic and biblical passages refer only to the male gender. Gendered language is especially dangerous with sacred texts like the Qur'an and the Bible that have been interpreted and translated thousands of times, because a phrase that was originally intended to explicitly refer to all genders often devolves into only explicitly referring to men. For the Qur'an and the Bible to hold to their fundamental principles, they must be flexible enough to accommodate innumerable cultural situations, because of its claims to be universally beneficial to those who believe. Therefore, to force these texts to have a single cultural perspective severely limits their application and contradicts the stated universal purpose of the books themselves. Making the interpretation of the Qur'an and the Bible more neutral makes it more accurate because it improves its potential to be universally beneficial and makes it applicable to a wider range of cultures and societies, and the same is true of the Bible. An androcentric interpretation of the text limits the Qur'an, and as a sacred text, it should not be confined to or exhausted by one society and their history. The feminist interpretations focus on transitioning to more neutrality in the sacred texts in order for the Bible and the Qur'an to include and legitimize women and increase their accuracy. Rather than focusing on rhetoric, Muslim and Christian feminists focus on the principles and the underlying ideas of the text. The diversity of Islamic societies necessitates different interpretations of the Qur'an, but those societies must understand the principles intended by the particulars. Those principles are eternal and can be applied in various social contexts. Focusing on principles gives the Qur'an and the Bible more flexibility and helps to avoid anachronistic teachings and traditions. The Muslim feminists base their insistence on the basic principle that is resonating within the Qur'an, which is equality. And so, to them, any examples of inequality should be discarded as they are time-bound and changeable. They argue that inequality in the Qur'an is a sign of the culture and not the Qur'an's teaching. Another argument against the androcentric interpretation, this mindset that the Muslim feminist interpretation, when it achieves equality, adheres closer to the Qur'an's intent, because it is not influenced by the culture. This alternative, in both faiths, focuses on the principles rather than the rhetoric in order to benefit a wider group of believers. Now, let's move on to some of the differences between the two interpretations, and this is kind of what I thought was most interesting in my research. Muslim feminists must uniquely overcome the mindset that equates feminism with westernization. Hegemonic powers often use Western feminism and other social issues as an excuse to justify occupation and violent interventions in the Muslim world. In most cases, Western interference has only damaged the potential of Muslim feminism, because they view this feminism as an encroachment upon their faith tradition and as a foreign Western import violently opposed to their way of life. While Christian feminists can focus on reshaping narratives, the Muslim feminist interpretation takes a more subtle approach by emphasizing altering language and focusing on principles. Both methods are effective means of achieving their goals, but the Christian feminists have the luxury of taking a bit bolder approach. Just as the patriarchal interpretations have had wide-reaching impacts on women's positions in their churches, feminist theological scholars argue that because feminist interpretations provide women with a narrative and more gender-neutral language, they should be able to gradually reduce the effects of exclusion. Narrative allows women to reclaim dignity and voice, to reconnect with themselves and their own communities of belonging against a larger society which intends to invisibilize them. With a correct feminist interpretation, both the Bible and the Qur'an already have the content within them to lead to equality in churches. They argue that the Qur'an has the potential to overcome the oversimplification that has characterized some traditional interpretations, which have repressed the potential of women. In conclusion, with similar long-term goals, the Muslim and Christian feminist interpretations of their sacred texts both focus on inclusion, principles, and neutral language. Reinterpreting the Quran and the Bible provides an opportunity for increased representation and better experiences in religion for women of faith.